So hey, we're in week 25 of our study of the book of Genesis, and so we've been going through the book here for several months. We have about another 10 weeks left or so, and then we're going to be moving on to the Gospel of John, in case you were wondering about the future. But we're going to be in Genesis 37 this morning, and so Genesis 37 is really an important chapter in the book of Genesis. In a sense, it's kind of one of the corners that we turn in our study. Going all the way back to Genesis 12, we've been looking at the life, ministries, the times, the days of the patriarchs of Israel. And we've looked at Abraham, we looked at Isaac, we looked at Jacob. And starting here in Genesis 37, we're going to look at the last of the kind of major figures in the book of Genesis, and that is Joseph. Now, kind of if you've been with us the past number of weeks, or even if you just kind of know the book of Genesis and have kind of thought through this in the past, in my mind at least, it's kind of interesting that the narrative would turn, and it's really going to turn for really 13 chapters, and focus on Joseph. And I wouldn't expect that if I didn't know the book of Genesis, simply for this reason. Now, follow me here. Going all the way back to Genesis 12, you recall that God called Abraham out and brought him to the promised land and made this covenant with him. And God said in Genesis 12, 1 through 3, I'm going to do these three things for you. I'm going to give you great descendants. And so there is this promise, it's the personal aspect of the covenant. I'm going to make a great people. It's going to be as large as the stars of the heavens or the dust on the earth. And so I'm going to do this in you and through you, which was a great promise because, Abraham was 75 years old, had no children, but that was God's promise. Second thing, I'm going to give you a land, and that's the land of Canaan, the promised land. That's the national aspect of the covenant. Then lastly, and maybe most importantly for you and I'm going to bless the entire world in you and through you. That's the universal aspect of the covenant. That's the promise really of eventual salvation. And I say that the turn here to Joseph is a bit surprising because if you've kind of been tracing things, it went from Abraham and then it goes to Isaac, right? And he gets sort of all three aspects of the covenant to him. And then it goes from Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, who we just kind of finished up with, and we'll cover a bit more today of him. And he gets all three aspects of the covenant. And then, if you know the rest of the Bible, you know that the most important part, really, of this agreement is the promise of salvation that was fulfilled in through Jesus. And Jesus is the Lion of the tribe of Judah, right? And so I would expect the last part of this book to be about Judah. And while Judah does appear, he's not the main character here. Matter of fact, he's actually not really even sort of a stellar character in the narrative, as we'll see kind of going forward. But I think the method to the madness here, and the reason why it goes like it goes is this. Now, just logically speaking, if what happens is the promise keeps getting passed down to like the chosen son, right? And it's never the oldest son, right? Abraham, it goes to Isaac, not Ishmael, right? It then goes to Jacob and not Esau. So it's never the first son, but it is sort of like the favored son. But if it keeps getting passed down from father to favorite son, well then that's going to create some logical problems, right? Because you're never actually going to have, a whole bunch of descendants, right? Because there's only ever one guy that gets the promise, right? And you need a bunch of people. And so while it does go Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, it then goes from Jacob then to all 12 of his sons, right? And we need that, right? Because we need the multiplication effect to actually create the sons and daughters as the stars of the heavens and the dust of the earth, right? And so really all the sons get this part of the covenant, of whom Joseph is one, and so hence these chapters on Joseph. The national aspect, if there's not a bunch of people, then they're never going to get the land, right? They won't actually even need the land if they're just one guy. And so they all end up getting the land, right? And if you read up through later on in the Bible, the book of Joshua, we see the land actually gets doled out to all the tribes, right? And that gets fulfilled. But the universal aspect, this is the one that is fulfilled in Judah, who's not the first or the second son of Jacob. He's actually the fourth son. But he really is, I think, maybe in a sense, kind of like the first qualified son, maybe to get the universal, the salvific kind of promises of the covenant. And we'll get there in just a little bit. But all that to say, a bit surprising that it would turn to Joseph, because Joseph is actually the second youngest son here in the list of 12 that we've got. And really kind of by way of, since Benjamin is still a baby, he's sort of like the youngest son in a sense, who wasn't a baby. So maybe, again, a bit surprising. Well, before we get into verse 1 of Genesis 37, don't forget, we ended, actually, Genesis 35, we ended in verse 29, which is the last verse of the chapter. Great place to end, right? And in that verse it said, "And so Isaac breathed his last and died. And he was gathered to his people. He was old, and he was full of days. And his sons Esau and Jacob buried him." And so I said last week that didn't actually happen at that point in time, right? And this happens a lot in Scripture, that the chronology kind of is a little bit sort of overlapping and a little bit sort of positioned to kind of keep things together and make things sort of fit. And really, Genesis 35 was kind of like the death chapter. There are 3 deaths in a chapter, right? There's Deborah, there's Rachel, then we throw Isaac in for good measure. Although in actuality, as Genesis 37 begins, Isaac is still alive. Isaac's got another 11 years to go. And so Isaac was actually alive when Joseph was sold into Egypt, and he actually passes away chronologically before Israel moves down to Egypt, right? And so I say that just kind of to avoid maybe some confusion in case you were reading things kind of strictly chronologically. We're skipping over Genesis 36, largely because I have no desire to read 75 names I can't pronounce, because it's a big genealogy. But maybe I'll just kind of point this out, maybe in passing. And so it's a genealogy of Esau, right? The oldest son, the oldest of the twin boys. And actually, it's an important chapter in a couple of respects, because back in Genesis 25, let me read you one verse. You might recall that when Esau's mother, Isaac's wife, when she was expecting, she was wondering about sort of some troubles in pregnancy. The children are quarreling in her womb. And the Lord tells her, this is back in Genesis 25 and verse 35, or rather verse 23. The Lord says, "2 nations are in your womb, 2 peoples shall be separated from your body. 1 people shall be stronger than the other, and the older shall serve the younger." And so the idea here is that she had been told there are 2 peoples, there are 2 nations in your body, right? And so she had been promised that really both of your sons are going to turn into peoples or to nations, which not everyone who's born turns into a nation, right? And we get that. So that's actually a pretty big promise. And then when when Isaac blessed Esau in Genesis 27, in verse 39 and 40, he said to him, "Behold, your dwelling shall be of the fatness of the earth and of the dew from heaven. By your sword you shall live. You shall serve your brother, and it shall come to pass when you become restless that you shall break from his yoke, break his yoke from your neck." And so there's this promise, 2 promises. One, that Esau would become a nation, and secondarily, that he would not always sort of be under the thumb of his brother, right, Israel. And so here in Genesis 36, we have this long genealogy, and among other things, what this chapter shows in some detail is that Esau indeed did become a great nation. And so that was the fulfillment of the promise all the way back from Genesis 25, verse 23. And so indeed promise fulfilled, as God had said decades and decades earlier. Matter of fact, that was over a century earlier that promise was made. And then secondarily, let me read you just Genesis 36. Let me read you verses 6 and 7. It says this, "Then Esau took his wives," he had 4 wives, "his sons, his daughters, and all the persons of his household, his cattle and all his animals, all his goods, which he had gained in the land of Canaan, and he went to a country away from the presence of his brother Jacob. So he kind of gets out from under Jacob's thumb, in a sense, for their possessions were too great for them to dwell together, and the lands where they were strangers could not support them because of their livestock. And so Esau dwelt in Mount Seir, and Esau is Edom. And so what Esau does is he voluntarily leaves the promised land. He goes a little south, a little east, and he goes to the area around Mount Seir, which he becomes the nation of Edom, right? And so important that we have those details because those promises were given earlier in this narrative. And so now we have Jacob in the promised land. He's been in the promised land for about 11 years now. If you're kind of keeping up with various parts of the kind of chronology here, he's actually 108 years old at this time, has 12 sons, a bunch of daughters, has 3 wives who are left because his favorite wife had passed away. We saw that back in the previous chapter. And here he is. And so we'll pick it up in Genesis 37, verse 1. It says, "And now Jacob dwelt in the land where his father was a stranger, in the land of Canaan." And this is the history of Jacob. And so what this chapter is going to do for us, it's going to actually set up for us really the final 12 chapters of the book. And so in large part, Genesis 37, it introduces us to Joseph. It gives us the background. It gets things teed up for pretty much everything else that's going to happen, really starting in Genesis 39, because Genesis 38, that will be in next week, is sort of a little bit of a kind of parenthesis. But this chapter is setting us up for what is going to happen. And so there's Jacob. He's dwelling in the land. Matter of fact, he is living, we'll find out here in a moment, he's living in and around the city of Hebron, which is in the southern part of the Promised Land. It is really near where his father Isaac had lived for most of his life. Isaac is still alive. He's still there. He's elderly. There's Jacob living near his dad, as many of us do. You live near your parents when they get older to help take care of them. I'm sure that kind of thing was going on. And so here he is, middle of verse 2. "And so Joseph, being 17 years old, was feeding the flock with his brothers." And so we had last met Joseph a few chapters prior when he'd been born. Now he's 17 years old. So he spent most of his life in Canaan, 11 years in Canaan, 6 years back up with Uncle Laban. But most of his years are spent here. He's 17 years old, kind of the youngest non-baby of the brothers, as I said earlier. And really, most of his brothers actually are a good bit older than him, right? Most of his brothers are 15, 16 years older than him. There are some that are closer in age to him, but he's sort of, the teenager, right? And like teenagers, apologies to you if you're a teenager, Joseph knew everything. At least he thought he knew everything. Although he didn't know everything because he didn't know what he didn't know, and that's the problem with thinking that you know everything. And so he's 17 years old, but he's feeding the flock with his brothers. And the lad, that is Joseph, was with the sons of Bilhah and the sons of Zilpah. And so I think he's sort of with the sons, maybe, of the 2 kind of underwives, like the maidservant wives, mostly because those 4 of his brothers, they each had 2, were the ones that were for the most part, the closest in age to him. But I wonder as well if maybe there was some tension that was sort of built in because the first wife, Leah, and her 6 sons, she had the most sons, and the first sons, right, at least the first 4, were born before any of their sons were born. I wonder if there was maybe kind of some kind of tension there, right, as there had been tension between Leah and Rachel. And here is Rachel's son, the first son of the favorite wife. I wonder if there was sort of tension there, right, between the sons. Well, whatever reason was present, Joseph's hanging out with the 4 sons of the maidservants, his father's wives. And Joseph brought a bad report of them to his father. And so, he's 17 years old. He's hanging out with his older brothers. They do whatever they do. And he is a tattletale, right? He brings a bad report of them to his father, which in and of itself sort of is a bit of a commentary on Joseph. We could say, the guy had an interest in truth, right? I used to always wonder, why when my brother, I have an older brother, that why when he would do bad things, And I would go and tell my parents, kind of like Joseph there, that oftentimes my mother would say, "Don't be a tattletale." And I would think, why? Right? Because I'm supposed to speak truth. My brother did this. I'm just telling you truth. And, honestly, I think probably most of my, childhood self was just sort of trying to be truthful. I wasn't trying to get my brother necessarily in trouble, although that was probably mixed in a little bit. And that's sort of why you say don't be a tattletale, right? Because, if you're speaking truth with the intent of pulling someone else down and elevating yourself, then it's really just pride being manifest, right? Which is why it would be wrong. And so, the intent of what we do is important, as is what we do. But in Joseph, just didn't see anything wrong with this. And perhaps there wasn't anything necessarily wrong with it. But Joseph kind of comes across here, as we'll see, as innocent, as concerned with truth, and he also comes across as a bit naive. And several things that he does here, kind of not putting together, like if you do this, well then this might happen. And quite honestly, Jacob comes across here in his narrative a bit out of touch and maybe a bit naive as well. Verse 3, it says, "Now Israel loved Joseph more than all of his children because he was the son of his old age." Right? So we talked about this earlier because we've seen this in the previous chapters kind of come up in differing ways. We've seen that, hey, when there is a favorite son, man, it never goes well really for anybody, right? And I get it. I have 5 children. I know you tell your kids that you love them all equally, but you really don't. And we all know that, right? But you're supposed to kind of make it secret, right? And not sort of let on. That's the case. They'll pick up on it, but you do your best, right? Well, man, Joseph, he's the favorite son. It makes sense. He is the first son of the favorite wife. I imagine every time that Jacob sees Joseph, he sees his favorite wife still and thinks about her. She's passed away. Remember all that, right? From 2 chapters back. But the dude makes no attempt to hide the fact, right? It says also he made him a tunic of many colors, right? Like not only do my actions and not only do my emotions, my words bear this out, but I'm going to actually dress you up special so nobody can miss the fact that you are the favorite son, and the tunic of many colors. Now, maybe your translation has a different sort of word there. Again, I'm reading New King James. I think most translations say something like a coat of many colors. There is some debate, and some translations have this differently because the word there for colors can also mean sleeves. And so some translations say he gave him a coat with long sleeves, which is not as impressive like in the cartoon version of the story. So it could have been a long-sleeved coat. It could have been a coat of many colors. But actually, it kind of does fit together, and this is why the word's hard to translate. The idea was that he was favored. He had this really sort of, nicely, beautifully embroidered long-sleeve coat, perhaps, right? And the idea was that, man, if you were the favored son, then you were going to be sort of the overseer. You're going to be over everyone else because you're favorite, so you're in charge. And if you're in charge, you can then wear a long-sleeved coat because you don't have to worry about getting your sleeves tattered because you aren't doing any of the hard work, right? And so that's kind of what's going on here. The coat was sort of not only showing favoritism, but it was also displaying the fact that, man, he was kind of the one who was responsible for overseeing and bringing reports, which is what he does here throughout this entire chapter. So he is the favored son. Verse 4, "But when his brothers saw that their father loved him more than all his brothers, they hated him and could not speak peaceably to him." And so, what did Jacob think was going to happen? You know what I'm saying? Like, how in his mind was it going to go well that you make essentially the youngest son, the favorite son, and you put him over the other brothers, right? There's no possible world that this is actually going to work in, but this is what Jacob has done. And so there is this sort of seething hatred that arises. And it's actually interesting to me. I know we covered a mistake that Reuben had made back in chapter 35. You recall that he actually had slept with his stepmother, which was a bad thing. And we talked about that and about how that actually lost him holding in the family when later on Jacob blesses the family at the end of the book. But Reuben actually was the oldest son, right? And Reuben's the one who really, in a sense, had the most to lose by this favoritism of Joseph, right? But as we'll see here coming up in a few verses, Reuben actually is sort of like the best son in this chapter, that he's the one who actually wants to spare Joseph's life, even though he was the one who had the most to lose. And so interesting kind of these dynamics. But although that's coming up, nevertheless, they all hated him because he was the golden child. Verse 5, now Joseph had a dream, and he told it to his brothers, which again, this kind of shows like the innocence, but also the naive nature of Joseph. And they hated him even more. And so he said to them, please hear this dream which I have dreamed. There we were, binding sheaves in the field, and behold, my sheaf arose and stood upright, and indeed your sheaves stood all around and bowed down to my sheaf. Now, you don't need a PhD in dream interpretation to figure out the meaning of this deal, right? This is pretty clear, what this dream means. And just the fact that Joseph was not picking up on the fact his brothers hated him, right? Clearly he wasn't processing that, because if you process that, you kind of want to walk on your tiptoes around them, right? But rather than doing that, he says, hey guys, gather around. I had this dream. In my dream, I was in charge of y'all, just like Dad says, right? This is clearly, this is not the move to make. And I sort of have, in one sense, I can sort of, I guess, identify in a sense with this. For whatever reason, I have all types of failings, as y'all can testify. But one of the things that I feel like God has given me sort of like an uncommon amount of common sense, more than most people. And I say that because things that seem common to me are clearly not common to most people, right? And I'm like, what are you doing? If you do that, this is gonna. Can't you see this, right? Well, Joseph, didn't have that gift, right? He didn't have common sense, because had he had it, he wouldn't have told the dream. He would have kept quiet about it. But verse 8, and his brother said to him, as we would expect, shall you indeed reign over us, or shall you indeed have dominion over us? So they hated him even more for his dreams and for his words. And so you're going to see this whole thing's building, right? Like he is the golden child, he has the pretty coat, he's in charge of them, he's having dreams, purportedly from God, probably from God, right? That are endorsing this thing. Verse 9, and then he dreamed still another dream. It gets worse. And he told it to his brothers and said, look, now he had to see their reaction to the first dream episode, right? Put it together, man. Read the room. You got to be able to see what's going on here. But, he was totally oblivious to this, right? Again, innocent, naive. Then he dreamed still another dream, and he told it to his brothers and said, look, I have dreamed another dream. And this time, the sun, the moon, and the 11 stars bowed down to me, right? So, it's not just a small little field thing that we're doing. It's the entire sort of a cosmic picture here, right? Everyone's bowing down to me. I'm in charge of all things. Look at me. And so he told it to his father and his brothers. So he loops in Dad this time. And his father has rebuked him and said to him, what is this dream that you have dreamed? Shall your mother and I and your brothers indeed come and bow down into the earth before you? And his brothers envied him. And his father kept the matter in mind. I can't wait to watch this. This video in heaven. I'm going to watch this. I'm going to see their faces and see his face, and I'm going to talk with Joseph and be like, dude, how could you not have picked up on the vibe that was in the room, right? But he clearly did not. And note as well, the sun, the moon, and the stars, right? And even as his dad rebukes him, shall I and your mother and your brothers bow down before you? Well, and his mother had already died. Right? And so, in a sense, this sort of makes no sense, unless it's maybe the references to, maybe his stepmom Leah. I don't know. Whatever the deal is, just as Jacob giving the youngest son the pretty coat, how is that going to go well? So Joseph telling his brothers who already hate him these two dreams of his ruling over them, how is that going to go well, right? But that's what he does. And so they're not really happy with him. I can just imagine all the brothers are sitting around and going no way, no way. And Joseph is going, Yahweh. Yeah, think about it. You'll get it later. All right, so verse 12. dreams told, but man, more narrative here to unfold. It says, and then his brothers went to feed their father's flock in Shechem. All right, so again, kind of pick up here on what's going on. And so going back a few chapters, right, going back to chapters 33, 34, 35, that you remember that when Jacob and his family and his sons, when they arrived in the promised land after they interacted with Esau, you remember that the family settled down outside of Shechem, right? You remember that story, right? And you remember we talked about last week the rape of Dinah, and then the pillaging, the plundering, and the genocide of all the folks that lived in Shechem, right? And you remember how Jacob was upset with his sons, like, I can't believe that you did this. You just killed all the Canaanites that lived in Shechem, and now everyone's going to rise up against me and they're going to kill me. Remember all that story, right? Well, that was less than a year ago, right, in the chronology here, right? And so less than a year ago, man, Israel, his family, has wiped out Shechem, right? But they had lived there for over a decade, 10, 11 years, right? And so that was the place that the brothers knew. And so that was actually over 50 miles north of Hebron, where they were living, right? And so they take this 50-mile trek, would have been probably 2 or 3 days' journey, back up to Shechem. Of course, they didn't have to worry about anybody hurting them because they had killed everyone that lived there, right? And they knew the area. They knew there was a lot of land there. They knew that there were pastures there. And so they go up there kind of, I guess, maybe to investigate their old haunts, right? They maybe see some friends who were still there whom they hadn't killed or whatever. I don't know. But they go to Shechem, and Jacob knows that's where they've gone, which just shows a complete kind of 180 in his fear less than a year earlier. But verse 13, it says, and Israel said to Joseph, are not your brothers feeding the flock in Shechem? So again, he knew where they were, right? He says, come, and I will send you. And so he says to him, here I am. And so then verse 14, and he said to him, please go and see if it's well with your brothers and well with the flocks, and bring back word to me. So he sent him out of the valley of Hebron, and he went to Shechem. And again, it's like, pay attention here. Like, right? Jacob, Joseph, read the room. Like, how is this going to go well? Like, the brothers hate this brother, right? All the brothers hate Joseph, and Jacob should have picked up on that. If he didn't pick up on that from, the colorful coat, he should have picked up on it from the whole dream incident, right? Even he was upset with his son, right? He had to see all the brothers are upset, right? And so, hey, all your brothers who really, really, really hate you, so much that they have gone 50 miles away to get away from you, right? Are going back to this unstable part of the country where we've previously killed everyone. Hey, Joseph, why don't you go alone up there and check on them and make sure they're okay? Really? If I'm Joseph, I'm like, no, Dad, I'm not going. Or send me in 50 guys or whatever, right? But he's like, here I am. And so there Joseph, all alone, goes off on this multi-day hike to see his brothers who hate him, to fulfill a role that they hated. Younger brother is the overseer. He's there to do what? He's there to get a report and to go back and tell Dad and tattle on you, right? So again, how is this going to go well? But no one seems to be picking up on this whole deal. I thought of 1 John 3:15, where John writes that whoever hates his brother is a murderer, and you know that no murderer has eternal life abiding in him, right? They clearly hated him, right? And now actually they're going to put the plan together to perhaps murder him, which is the exact same thing that John was warning about, 1 John 3 and verse 15. Well, here in Genesis 37, verse 15, it says, now a certain man found him, and there he was, wandering in the fields, and the man asked him, saying, what are you seeing, or who are you seeking? And he said, I'm seeking my brothers. Please tell me where they're feeding the flocks. And the man said, they have departed from here. I heard them say, let us go up to Dothan. And so Joseph went after his brothers and found them in Dothan. And so Dothan is yet another day's journey, 15 miles north of Shechem. And so he's getting really far afield of where the family is living. He's being separated more and more each day, each step. He's getting further and further away from his father, and really heading up to essentially the middle of nowhere, this northern part of Canaan, sort of almost up by what became the Sea of Galilee, and it really sort of a barren sort of part of the country. But one thing that was there in Dothan was a trading route. And so folks that are coming down out of Mesopotamia and going into Egypt are going to pass through this frontier town of Dothan. Dothan actually means two wells, is what it means in Hebrew. And so perhaps the brothers needed water, and maybe there was not enough water in Shechem, and so they're heading up to this area of Dothan to find water for the flocks. We're not sure, but whatever reason is, they've gone to Dothan. And so Joseph resolves to go there as well. Verse 18, now, when the brothers saw him afar off, even before he came near, they conspired against him to kill him. So these guys really hate their brother, right? They just see him in the distance, and they're coming up with a plan to kill him. Of course, they've probably been talking for days about that dreamer, right? Who we can't stand, like that one annoying brother, right? Who Dad has put over us and is always telling on us and everything, right? And so it's not going to go well. Verse 19, and they said to each other, look, this dreamer is coming. Come therefore, and let us now kill him and cast him into some pit. And we shall say, some wild beast has devoured him, and we shall see what will become of his dreams. Now, I know that there are annoying people in your life. We all have them, right? I call them VDPs, very draining people. They're essentially sanctification opportunities, right? God brings these people into your life, your neighbors, maybe, the in-laws, your boss, whatever, right? But you got to really hate somebody a lot that you actually, in advance, come up with a plan to kill them, right? It's one thing, like, they kind of push you over the edge, maybe you snap and do something, right? But to plan their death in advance. This is a pretty deep-seated hatred that these brothers have. And it's not just one person, like one brother that comes up with it. Like, they're in Congress together talking about this, and they're in agreement that this is actually what we're going to do. Now, we learn actually later on here in the narrative that, so the first four brothers, remember, it was Reuben, Simeon, Levi, and Judah. We learn that it's Simeon, it's actually the second brother, who's actually driving the ship in regard to this plan. And we learn that later on here. And you might recall that when Joseph ends up in Egypt and the brothers come down, and at first he takes a brother and puts him in jail. That's actually Simeon that he puts in jail because he was the guy that was driving this whole thing. And we talked about this two chapters back, how it was Simeon and Levi who led the charge and who deceived the people in Shechem, like with the circumcision idea, right? And went in and killed them all. All the brothers went in and pillaged the city, but it was Simeon and Levi who were the ones that were driving that. And so it seems to be like this bloodlust seems to reside in Simeon and Levi. And we talked about, that's why in Genesis 49, when Jacob is sort of blessing and foretelling the future of his sons, he says that Levi and Simeon are going to be scattered because of their anger and what they have done, what they're like. And indeed that did happen in regard to the placement of the tribes in Israel. We talked about that last week, how Simeon actually is put right in the middle of Judah by way of land allotment. So he's surrounded, in a sense, by hopefully a good influence, and Levi gets scattered throughout the entire land, becoming, ironically, the priestly tribe. Well, this plan, look, let's kill the dreamer, and probably Simeon is leading this whole thing. Verse 21, but as I said earlier, but Reuben heard it, and he delivered him out of their hands, saying, let us not kill him. Which, again, we can't say Reuben's a hero, right? Because, he's already slept with his stepmom in the previous chapter, and so obviously had some issues going on. But again, being the oldest son, who had the most to lose, I am sort of intrigued that he is the one that actually seems to be mature enough to actually say, hey, let's not kill him. And later on in Genesis 42, when they're down in Egypt before Joseph, facing all the troubles there, that actually Reuben says to his brothers, he says, didn't I tell you, do not sin against the boy? And so, Reuben not only wanted to perhaps spare his father the grief of, grieving for a dead son, but also he's sensing, there's something that it's not just us doing bad things against our annoying brother, but, to harm Joseph is actually going to be, to sin against him, in a sense, right? So maybe he's kind of putting together, the dreams that Joseph shared with us that those actually were from God. And there's more going on here than what we might sort of detect on the surface, right? Well, whatever the deal was, Reuben actually wants to spare his life, and he suggests let's not kill him, but he actually does a pretty poor job actually in sparing his life, because we'll see coming up here in verse 29 that, Reuben, for whatever reason, he departs from this entire scene and ends up not being actually in the proper place to spare Joseph's life. And it kind of maybe a lesson there for us is that, it's good to not sort of join the crowd in sin, but if you do so in a way that you're not actually clearly showing godly moral leadership, then you're not really much better than everyone else, right? To truly stand up and to truly lead out in the right direction, should be done, overtly and purposely. But rather than doing that, Reuben kind of like, well, let's not kill him. Let's do something else to him. Verse 22, and Reuben said to them, shed no blood, but cast him into this pit, which is in the wilderness, and don't lay a hand on him, that he might deliver him out of their hands and bring them back to his father. And so he had a plan. I'm going to deliver him, even though he didn't say that. That was his plan. So they put him in this pit, or maybe your version says a cistern. And so this would have been like a pit or this dugout of the hard ground for gathering water. It could have been one of the two wells. Again, Dothan means two wells that was there in this area. But it was dug such that things that went in could not get out. And so he plans to put him in and then save him later, verse 23. So it came to pass when Joseph had come to his brothers that they stripped Joseph of his tunic, the tunic of many colors that was on him, and they took him and cast him into a pit, and the pit was empty, and there was no water in it. And so apparently there's no more water in Dothan than there was in Shechem. That's why they went there. Verse 25, and they sat down to eat a meal. So, what an incredible verse, right? They sat down to eat a meal. And so, you've just assaulted your brother. You've just tore up, his pretty coat. You've thrown him down into this pit, with the intent, of doing him harm. And rather than wrestling with your guilty conscience, you sit down to have a meal together, right? Which just shows the coldness that was there, right? And you got to wonder, again, that 10 years when Jacob decided to have his family reside in Shechem, right outside of that incredibly immoral city, you got to wonder the effect that the culture had on Jacob's young sons, to the point that they would be so callous that they would corporately agree to kill their brother, and after assaulting him, would just sit down for a meal. And later on in Genesis 42, as they're recounting this whole event, they talk about, and he was pleading with us, and didn't we hear his cries, and we didn't help him, right? So it's not just like he's in there being quiet and they're having a snack, right? Like they're having a meal and they're having to listen to him, his cries for help out of this pit that they've thrown him into. It says, and then they lifted up their eyes and they looked, and there was a company of Ishmaelites. So remember Abraham, Isaac and Ishmael, right, brothers. And so these are descendants of Ishmael, coming from Gilead with their camels, bearing spices, balm and myrrh, on their way to carry them down to Egypt. And so the Ishmaelites had resided there, just to the east of the Promised Land, and a lot of them are kind of up in the northern part of that piece of land up there, kind of abutting Mesopotamia. And so they're traveling down south to Egypt with their various wares in order to trade. And so verse 26, so Judah said to his brothers, what profit is there if we kill our brother and conceal his blood? All right, so enter Judah, right? The one who would sort of carry the universal aspect of the Abrahamic covenant. Judah speaks up, and in a similar manner to Reuben, he kind of is like, hey, let's not kill him, right? Like, we don't want to kill our brother, but hey, let's sell him. I'm not sure that's much better. I guess I'd rather be sold than murdered, but nevertheless, it's in one sense, it's sort of like more selfish. In his rationale, like, hey, if we kill him, we're not going to get anything out of this whole deal. But if we sell him, we'll get rid of him plus get some money, right? So that's the plan. But again, you see that, it's Reuben and it's Judah, the first and fourth sons that come off here a little bit better than Simeon and Levi, who seem to actually never come off well in the text. And so he says, again, verse 26, and so Judah said to his brothers, what profits there if we kill our brother and conceal his blood? Come, let us sell him to the Ishmaelites, and let not our hand be upon him, for he is our brother and our flesh. And his brothers listened. And then the Midianites, traders, passed by. So sometimes Midianites are called Ishmaelites and vice versa. It's the same group of folks. They passed by. And so the brothers pulled Joseph up and lifted him out of the pit. And they sold him to the Ishmaelites for 20 shekels of silver. And they took Joseph to Egypt. And so 20 shekels of silver is later in the Mosaic Law actually going to be the price to free a slave. But they actually are selling the brother as a slave. 20 shekels of silver is about 8 ounces of silver, which at the current rate is about $250. And so this is not necessarily a lot of money. And so they really didn't like their brother. I mean, they're selling him for a bargain even, right? But he's been sold into slavery. But I mean, just again, how hard does your heart have to be, right? Because I mean, it's not like poisoning someone who dies when you're not there, right? They're actually there with him. They have physically assaulted him in person. They have thrown him into a pit in person. They've brought him up out of the pit in person. There are the traders. They're actually handing him over in person to these folks, listening to him cry and say no. And they're taking the money in the presence of their brother, right? And what coldness and what hardness and what hatred that these brothers had for their naive, innocent, younger brother. And so he's sold and he's taken down to Egypt, verse 29. And then Reuben returned, which we actually hadn't been told that he left, but he obviously left if he is returning. And Reuben returned to the pit, and indeed Joseph was not in the pit, and he tore his clothes. And so you can actually really see here how much Reuben actually wanted to free his brother, right? And how much he really did plan, as it says earlier in verse 22, to actually free him and bring him back to his father, right? And so that wasn't just a one-off. That's really what Reuben wanted to do. Of course, where did he go? For this time, I mean, we're simply not told where he went. I mean, did he go into the city to get some drinks? I mean, I don't know, right? But he's gone. And verse 30, and he returned to his brothers and said, the lad is no more, and I, where shall I go? And so there's a sense maybe that a part of his actions might have been driven by the fact that he was the oldest son, although a disgraced older son because everyone knew about what he'd done with his stepmom. But as the oldest son, there's a sense in which he would have been held accountable for the boy because he was the oldest. And so maybe part of this is driven by that. We're not told, but I do think he does kind of come across as being genuinely concerned and not just selfishly not wanting to be held accountable. But verse 31, and so they took Joseph's tunic, they killed a kid of the goats, and they dipped the tunic in the blood. And they sent the tunic of many colors, and they brought it to their father and said, we have found this. Do you know whether it is your son's tunic or not? And so, there's something about idolatry that actually blinds us to common sense, right? We all make idols out of things. I mean, we make idols out of, the traditional sinful things. I mean, drugs and alcohol, whatever. We make idols out of good things. I mean, your family can be an idol. Your job can be an idol. Sports can become an idol. But whatever your idol is, it can blind you to reality. It can kind of cut you off from truth. And it can make you lose common sense. And I can sort of see this here. I think that Joseph not only is the favored son of Jacob, but I think he is the idol of Jacob, right? Which is why he hasn't seen his idolatry of Joseph. He hasn't seen what that's done to the other brothers. But even here now, when the brothers return, and so again, days have gone by, right? So it's been a week or so since Joseph has left. They come and they're like, hey, we found this coat. Is this the coat? Is this your son's coat or not? Well, obviously it was. Everyone knew it, right? But what are logically speaking, what are the chances that Joseph is going to travel 65 miles away to a general area, but not knowing exactly where the brothers are. It's going to be this multi-day journey. Like, what are the chances that he's going to be killed by a wild animal, and the brothers are going to stumble across the coat? Right? It seems a bit fishy to me, right? At least I'm asking the question. Like, where did you find it? Like, tell me some more about it. Because it's like you lose $5 out in the parking lot out here. Like, you might find it next week, but it's a little fishy. That's your story. I'm like, I don't know about that story, right? Like, it was windy, it rained, and what are the chances, right? Well, because Joseph was his idol, as soon as his idol was taken away, he just jumps to conclusions, right? Because he can't see clearly. He's been blinded to truth. And again, don't pile too much here on Jacob, because we all have idols, and we all actually act like this. And we can't see what our worship of something other than God is doing to us. Verse 33, and he recognized it and said, "It is my son's tunic. A wild beast has devoured him. Without doubt, Joseph is torn to pieces." Which again, why do you go there? Like, maybe he's just been injured, or like he's in some other town, like in some hospital somewhere or whatever, right? But he jumps. He's been torn up, right? Which is what his brothers wanted him to conclude. So I'm sure they were kind of goading him into that, maybe even suggesting that kind of thing, right? Verse 34. Then Jacob tore his clothes, put on sackcloth on his waist, and he mourned for his son many days. And all his sons and all his daughters arose to comfort him, but he refused to be comforted and said, "For I shall go down into the grave to my son in mourning." Thus his father wept for him, right? And so, if it's not clear before this, it's clear now, that Joseph was clearly an idol for Jacob, right? It's one thing, to mourn a friend or a family member who has passed away, right? And we've all had that happen to us. I tell you, I just like everybody upstream from me, like all my parents, everyone's dead. I've had a lot of funerals, a lot of mourning, and myself. And so it's appropriate to mourn, appropriate to grieve, certainly so. But it gets to a point where you have to say, we need to keep going on. That's not to dishonor the one who's passed away. It's just life, right? But Jacob's plan is to not ever get over it, and even to die in his mourning, right? Which just kind of shows, maybe things are a little out of balance here, Dad, right? We're all upset, and this is a bad plan that you're going to actually die in the midst of the mourning. And really, if you're like one of the brothers and you're watching this unfold, how, again, cold and hard do you have to be? One of them at least, right? Say, "Hey, Dad, we got something to tell you." Right? I know it's not going to go well for you, when you tell them that, but wouldn't that be better than watching your dad die in mourning, right? But that's not what they do. And then verse 36. Just as time is expiring here, now the Midianites had sold him in Egypt to Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh and captain of the guard. And so things are teed up now, really, for the rest of the story with Joseph, right? And so next week, we're going to have a brief interlude. We're going to look at the Judah and Tamar incident, which is kind of stuck in here, which come back for that. I promise there's good stuff there. But starting in verse 1 of 39, that's where we'll get to the rest of the Joseph story. Time's gone. I'll pray for us and we'll be dismissed. Father, thank you for your word. We thank you, Lord, that you're patient with us. For indeed, in a sense, Lord, we're all like Jacob. Lord, we're all like Joseph, not able to see what's going on, making idols out of even good things at times, and certainly not being concerned with your people and your word and truth to the degree that we ought to, Lord. But we're thankful most of all for Christ, and that forgiveness is always available. We're thankful, Lord, that in the midst of our sin is your mercy. And we're thankful, Lord, for the chance to look into your word, to hopefully nourish our faith each week, to become more like Christ, and to be better equipped to serve you and your kingdom. And we ask all of this in Christ's name. Amen. See y'all next week.